Welcome to the Chaos Sector. We continue our investigation into the Idaho murders case. Brian Kohberger has been charged with the murders of 4 college students and is currently in court preparing to be tried. First, let's address something. Our analysis of Kernodle and Chapin being murdered first is coming from what investigators claim to unfold. So, correct the investigators, since you somehow know for sure who was murdered first. Honestly, nobody knows who was murdered first. Some claim Gonsalves and Mogan were murdered first, then Kernodle and Chapin. It's semantics, because the same setting exists, of the opposing pair, including Mortensen, being aware of someone in the home. Many suggest it was a party home? And many people had the code to the door? Well, are we going to include Kohberger? How could Kohberger have a code to that door, if he wasn't known by anyone in that area? So either he was familiar through some circle linked to that home, or someone inside the home gave him the code. Pick your poison. If he was familiar through a circle linked to the home, then we have to evaluate who could possibly be involved on the outside. If someone gave him the code from the inside, well, that's self-explanatory. Detectives claim that Kohberger's DNA was found in the victim's home, and a knife sheath was also found in the bedroom of the victims. Surveillance footage also spotted a white Hyundai Elantra in that area, which is assumed to have been Kohberger's. But, the most important key pieces of evidence have never been collected. The knife which was used, and Kohberger's DNA on any of the victims. Let's momentarily break this down, because without these 2 key pieces of evidence, everything collected by detectives is essentially circumstantial evidence. The authorities claim that the victims put up a struggle. Based on autopsies, they also had defensive wounds as well. Okay, this is where empirical evidence needs to be presented. To this point, there has not been a report that claims Kohberger's DNA was found on the victims, in connection to the victims' struggle. What does this mean in a court setting? Well, sometimes there isn't a fire, where there's smoke. I know that sounds a bit controversial to some, who believe Kohberger committed the murders, but without the most important evidence you could provide against a murder suspect, how do you prove this suspect has committed that crime? Once again, when a victim is stabbed to death, who put up a struggle and had defensive wounds, this means the extent in which the victim and suspect engaged will obviously lead to DNA being the key factor to a conviction. A survivor's accounts of seeing the suspect, a vehicle being spotted, a knife sheath, does not prove that he murdered those individuals. Blood samples, even droplets of blood, from either the victim on Kohberger or his blood on the victims, could prove his guilt, and he would face his punishment. But there has never been blood samples collected, although there were 4 individuals stabbed to death. This is unlikely, despite the so-called tactical execution of those stabbings. Blood will be somewhere in those bedrooms, especially if there was a struggle. If those victims have defensive wounds, this would mean they put their hands up, flailing, trying to shield themselves from being stabbed, etc. Now, we all know there was blood everywhere. The problem though, is a different setting has been depicted, by the 2 survivors who claim their peers were merely unconscious. I guess their vision was impaired. But, hey, let's just go with it for now. Let's address the aftermath, the departure. Let's say, Kohberger left town, got rid of the weapon, the clothes, and all evidence in his vehicle which would link him to the crime scene. Regardless of what Kohberger did to erase all evidence, there is obviously evidence where the crime was committed. And this is where the problem lies for the prosecutors. You have to physically place Kohberger in the home on that night, with evidence that cannot be disputed. Otherwise, they merely have circumstantial evidence. A knife sheath found at the home seems to contradict not discovering any blood samples, right? Meaning, how could Kohberger be so careless in leaving his knife sheath, yet was so careful in stealthily stabbing 4 people without anyone becoming alarmed? But let's break down this evidence, because by definition, it is still evidence. A suspect in a crime was seen by a witness, fleeing the scene on foot after a convenience store robbery. Circumstantial evidence does not directly prove that a defendant committed a crime. The fleeing the scene on foot, from a crime scene, is circumstantial evidence that they committed the robbery. But the problem is, without the actual surveillance footage physically showing that suspect committing the robbery, there is no proof that they robbed the convenience store. Sure, it may be suspicious, and they may even be linked to the robbery. But there is no proof that this specific person committed the robbery. This proof would be surveillance footage, showing the suspect hold the cashier at gunpoint, that cashier giving them the money in the register, and the suspect fleeing the scene moments later. That is empirical evidence. So, let's apply this to Kohberger. His vehicle being spotted in that area is the only empirical evidence, because it was captured by surveillance. Everything else is circumstantial evidence. I must say, the alleged knife sheath found in the bedroom seems to be quite suspicious. Kohberger more than likely dropped this knife sheath while engaging his targets, right? Investigators claim the DNA of Koberger was found on a knife sheath recovered at the crime scene, and cell phone data shows that in the months before the attack, he was in the area of the victim's home multiple times. We will bypass the months prior of him in that area. We will focus on the alleged DNA found on the knife sheath. According to the newly unsealed court documents, traces of DNA from a lone male later determined to be Koberger were found on the button of a leather knife sheath found in the rental home where the victims were killed. A knife with a U.S. Marine Corps insignia on it was also found at the scene, though there's no record of Koberger having served in the military. So let me get this clear, a knife was also found? Whose knife was it? United States Marine Corps insignia? What does the knife look like? Remember, the news displayed a knife they assumed was used to stab the victims with. But no forensics done on the mysterious knife found at the crime scene? I think I know why, because that Marine Corps knife is a tactical knife. And it would raise questions as to why it was found at the scene of the crime, yet apparently without being utilized. We can suggest that this wasn't the suspect's weapon. After all, there wasn't a report that it was. Someone would have possessed that knife and intended on using it, right? And if we factor in the setting at the home, they would have been able to use it. And that leads to defensive attacks upon the suspect, which leads to stab wounds, blood being spilled from those wounds, DNA of the suspect collected as a result, bloodstains on the knife, you know how it goes. A tactical knife found, that was not used, does not seem to fit in the setting of that crime scene. The way they describe it, with no forensics apparently done on it, makes the knife appear to just be there, out in the open, popping up out of thin air. How does a Marine's tactical knife just sit in the bedroom, without anyone's ownership? Simply put, either it will be used, because it was apparently on the person who possessed it, or it isn't logical that it actually exists in the physical encounter that took place. So at this point, we have a knife at the crime scene, that has no owner. 4 college students were stabbed to death, the suspect's DNA is found on a knife sheath, a knife was also found, yet that knife has no connection to either Koberger or the victims. Stop. Let's be very careful here, because this is definitely an indication that there is evidence being omitted. And I would even go as far to say, evidence being tampered with. Quote, a knife with a U.S. Marine Corps insignia on it was also found at the scene, though there's no record of Koberger having served in the military. Unquote. They don't state that a forensic scan of that knife was done, they state quote, though there is no record of Koberger having served in the military. This is tricky wordplay, because they are not claiming it wasn't his knife, but they also are not claiming it was. Yet, this to me, is a bunch of gibberish. Here's why. If you have a suspect in custody, wouldn't you examine the knife for your suspect's DNA? If you were a detective, and you had a suspect in custody for the stabbings of 4 college students, wouldn't you have your forensics team examine a knife that was found at the crime scene? Of course, because this could possibly lead to a quick conviction of that suspect. It's detective work 101. But, if there is something to hide with that knife, you won't examine it. Fact, it has to be someone's knife, right? The question is, whose knife was it? Based on the authorities' report, we assume it wasn't the suspect's. A weapon at the crime scene has no link to the alleged killer, yet no ownership established based on forensics? Something is a bit fishy here. Are you following so far? We are only presenting what has been presented back to the public. What if? What if Koberger's DNA was possibly planted on this knife sheath, for building a case against him? But, why wouldn't they claim it was also his knife that was found? You may suggest, this is proof that they didn't plant his DNA on the knife sheath. Not so fast, here's a slithery tactic that could have been used. In a scenario where they are trying to frame their guy, all they need is DNA of their guy at the scene of the crime. Combine this with all the other quote, circumstantial evidence, and in court, the jury could be convinced to convict. The DNA on a knife sheath helps in this conviction. If they were to literally plant his DNA on the knife, then we assume this is the knife he used to stab his victims, which would be irrational for him to leave behind. And, it would obviously have bloodstains on it, which it didn't have. You understand? Let's address an important element of the case, because apparently Koberger left key evidence behind, and we're not talking about some knife sheath. For this, we want to display what FBI investigator, Bill Daley said about the suspect. One major piece of evidence investigators were working with was a 2013 white Hyundai Elantra spotted near the crime scene. While Koberger managed to get a new license plate for the car, it remained a quote, rolling crime scene after he drove it back home to Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, a last-ditch effort that failed miserably. According to Daley, this was his attempt to quote, park it, clean it, leave it, unquote. And, because he most likely got into the car with blood on him, investigators probably have more evidence linking him to the crimes. Quote, he got in with blood on him. And we know he had blood on his shoes, because he left it right in front of Diem's door. So we've got blood in the car, maybe on the steering wheel, maybe on the door handle, maybe on the inside of the door. So we want the car. We don't want it destroyed. We don't want it burned, unquote. Now this is what FBI investigator Bill Daley stated. But this is all a red herring, because there were no reports of blood found in the home by detectives, at any point to my knowledge. And even to this point, they have not collected these so-called blood samples, from the vehicle neither. Doesn't matter if the suspect bleached the vehicle into oblivion, there will be traces of DNA found somewhere. And the reason being? The eye can only see what is within its range of vision. In other words, you missed a spot. To claim that there was blood near Mortenson's room? If there was blood on his shoes, well, where exactly did this blood go, which was more than likely from his victims? If he had blood on his shoes, then there was a lot of blood, right? And this blood was never spotted by the roommates, who suggest that their peers were, quote, unconscious. We don't see evidence markers in the home, where bloodstains were, right? We don't see evidence markers, from the suspect's shoes, which had blood on them, right? If Daley claims the suspect left a blood print near Mortenson's bedroom, this will definitely be marked as evidence by detectives. It has a footprint of the suspect, right? That is very important evidence, and it would be developmental evidence if we recall how they reported, no suspect had been identified or arrested yet. But, search throughout, you will never see detective photos of this area marked as evidence. Kernodle and Chapin were murdered, stabbed to death, equals, blood. The killer then heads upstairs, stabs Gonsalves and Mogan to death, equals, blood. If the killer had blood on his shoes, these blood prints would be all over the floor, displaying his path. It doesn't matter if those blood prints came about after murdering the peers on the third floor, if they were discovered near Mortenson's bedroom, then there would be a trail of blood from that third floor. If it were from Kernodle and Chapin, that's even worse, because now there are more tracks of blood to and fro. The only so-called evidence of blood at the crime scene is coming from what appears to be blood, along the panel, outside, of the home. Let's examine. Now this is allegedly blood from the victims Kernodle and Chapin, on the second floor, right? Yet, this oozing blood from their bedroom apparently didn't have a pool of blood in that bedroom. And, to be honest, this is not even marked, so if it's not marked by detectives as evidence, then what is that substance trickling down from the panel? I can tell you right now, it is not blood. I need you to pay close attention, because if this were blood, it would be marked as evidence by detectives. So, the FBI flat out lied about it, and once again, this is becoming even more of a shady case. What is spotted along the panel outside the home is not blood. In fact, who took that photo? Because once again, if the detectives took that photo, and it were blood, cha-ching, there's key evidence, right? But no marker, so without a marker as blood, and someone at the crime scene took the photo, can we suggest that this was planted there? And this brings me back to someone being framed for murder. If this substance was placed along that wall to convince the public that it was blood, which is clearly malicious, we can also take that same malice and apply it to Koberger's DNA found on the knife sheath. As you should know by now, we only deal with logic, not sensationalism. What about the security camera that captured the audio from outside the home? It is reported that a dog was heard barking, someone was heard, quote, whimpering, and a loud thumping sound was also heard. If all of this was heard outside the home, then this activity is definitely heard inside the home. The only time the dog apparently barked was when Mortenson claimed she thought Gonsalves was playing with her dog at some point. I can let that one go. But the whimpering sounds? If this is heard outside the home and a loud thumping noise, that spells trouble inside the home. Let's just cut right to the chase. We understand being young and an experience such as that could be terrifying. But the witness was bypassed by the killer, which is unrealistic. And she has to know that her peers have been harmed, or even killed, because of that same loud thumping noise and whimpering she heard prior. With this killer walking right past her, despite being afraid, she has to call the authorities, right? But she doesn't do this. Mortenson locks herself in her bedroom and falls asleep. She doesn't want to face reality. She doesn't want to take on the responsibility of checking on her peers. She doesn't want to make sure everyone was safe. Mind you, this is her home, she shared with some of the victims. You have a responsibility to take action. She doesn't call the authorities, doesn't text any family members, nor other friends at that time. She sits there, till she falls asleep. Approximately 8 hours later, Mortenson and Funk call the authorities. Let's not focus on that, let's focus on what happened before that call. They both discover their roommates dead. Yes, they discovered them dead. Let's be real here, the whole unconscious narrative was a lie. And once again, shady reporting compromises a prosecution in the trial. It's not even worth debating, but we have to keep your brain stable in analyzing that scenario. Both wake up, right? Now, you have Kernodle and Chapin in their bedrooms. If there's blood pouring from their bedrooms on the outside of the home, would you believe that whoever went into that bedroom didn't spot any blood? And, Kernodle was found on the floor. Did her blood get smothered by her body, to why the peers couldn't spot it? And at this point, more than likely one would say, "Oh no, oh my god, Kernodle is dead!" Exclamation point. It's obvious how everything else would unfold. They panicked, called their friends over first, because they feared if they called the authorities, it would appear they were the main suspects. If you have 4 people stabbed to death in a home, and there are 2 people still alive, who have not been harmed, authorities are bringing them in first, regardless of how young and innocent they appear. Their survival, unharmed, warrants a thorough probe into what they know. When they asked Funk and Mortensen about the, "Wait, no, scratch that. The detectives saw the bloodbath, right?" So obviously they know the peers saw it as well. This indicates that their accounts upon discovering their peers lying in a pool of blood was tweaked to discovering their peers unconscious. Now if the detectives decide to change the reality of what took place, then we have to wonder what else has either been changed, or even worse, kept secret. So from the moment the authorities arrive at the home, we have dishonest detective work. They apparently didn't release a report upon arrival and what they discovered. This leads to either concealing key evidence from the public so it can be altered later, or literally taking key evidence from the crime scene to protect a potential suspect. You have shady accounts from one of the roommates. Peers claim their roommates were unconscious, when clearly blood was everywhere. Shady detective work, fake blood along the outside panel of the home. Authorities ruled both survivors out as suspects. A knife found in the home with no forensics done. Blood was never displayed at the crime scene somehow, yet an FBI investigator claims Kohberger had blood on his shoes. All of this indicates a cover-up. Now who is being covered for? Who knows, but I know one thing: if Kohberger did in fact murder those individuals, he had some help. It would explain the whole disregarding a witness issue. I leave you with this: there has to be an explanation for the knife that was found, and authorities have not linked this knife to anyone, let alone their suspect. A knife found at the crime scene, a knife sheath found, with traces of the suspect's DNA. What do you conclude here? That it's the suspect's knife, plain and simple. Without any DNA found on the knife, nor any victims, it is logical to suggest that the knife was planted there. And if that knife was planted there, then we have to also suggest the knife sheath was as well. And DNA? Well, if you want to take your guy down for the murders, it's quite easy to get his DNA in that home. Is this adding up to you? You're intelligent, so I know we're on the same page here. If anyone can bring about a better, more logical reason for these oddities at the crime scene, I would greatly appreciate your insight. Because at this point, this is starting to look like framework. We are not undermining the tragedy and those who lost their lives that night. But there needs to be accountability, transparency, integrity, and empirical evidence that brings us to the truth. Otherwise, I have no choice but to be more pessimistic than optimistic in view of the case. Remember, we only deal with logic here. And to this point, the logic of charges against Kohberger is a bit questionable. And, it's not just the allegations against him that are questionable, it is the setting at the home that night. The FBI investigator claims to have evidence that Kohberger was there, based on his shoes having blood on them. How do you know they are his shoes? Have you done forensics on his vehicle? Not that I know of. Can't wait to release that so-called evidence now. There's a trial starting. This would have been already confirmed. No evidence based on that, which is placing him physically in the home. They also suggest that he was careless by leaving his knife sheath at the scene of the crime. But, I thought he had gloves on. If you traced his DNA on that knife sheath, based on some type of cellular contact upon it, surely there's even more DNA that matches Kohberger in the home, which would be even greater evidence. You know, such as physically tussling with his victims? No DNA was reported here neither. And that just about does it. They do not have actual evidence, they have suspicion, assumptions, circumstantial, possible evidence. In court, a defense team will hit them hard on this, because nothing concrete has been proven. Remember, the defense is already preparing to challenge the so-called DNA on the knife sheath. Understand, DNA tests are not 100% accurate, the process simply narrows it down to just a few possibilities within the human population. This isn't a pro-Kohberger march, we are investigating. And what we discovered from the beginning was a case that doesn't seem to add up. So what gives? Well, think all the answers to our questions are in that home. Let's go over a few key factors. Kohberger was allegedly spotted in surveillance, driving near the area of the murders. This, if it was in fact his vehicle, raises much suspicion. Although this doesn't prove he committed a crime, the irony of him being spotted in surveillance, the night there were murders, convinces many he is guilty of those crimes. Detectives claim they have Koberger's DNA on a knife sheath that was found at the scene of the crime. Although this is DNA, which is the most effective way to convict a suspect in a murder charge, simply loses its credibility. Here's why. The traces of Koberger's DNA they allege to have may not be 100% accurate, based on microscopic flaws of DNA testing. If this is their main piece of evidence, they have a defense who is challenging this, so apparently they have a legitimate rebuttal to that evidence. You need more concrete evidence, and in court, if there isn't any DNA that is more revealing in direct interaction with the victims, it starts to become, well, microscopic. Ironic, isn't it? The very element of obtaining DNA is the very element that reduces the believability of the evidence against the suspect. Let me explain. The jury is envisioning the suspect brutally stabbing his victims, blood everywhere, right? And yet, throughout this massacre, the only effective evidence against this suspect is a trace of his DNA on a knife sheath. You can claim he is somewhat clever, but there is no way that is the main evidence against him. And, let's not forget how they would obtain this trace. It has to be through some sort of cellular contact through his gloves, onto the knife sheath, right? He was wearing gloves, keep that in mind. If the glove ripped, you would literally have fingerprints. So, it has to be perhaps a trace of his fingerprint through the gloves, right? And this may be where the inaccuracy of the DNA trace may come from, because a fingerprint trace through a glove, obviously is not as accurate, as literally a fingerprint with flesh contact. They didn't say they had his fingerprints on the knife sheath. They have a trace of his DNA on the knife sheath. This is a very small quantity, so small, it can't be what? Accurately measured. I'm starting to believe, they don't even have this so-called trace of his DNA, because in context of the physical activity in the home, that is the last piece of evidence that would be noticed. Think about it, a massacre doesn't have any other leads of a suspect? What are the chances of that? Well, as much as the possibility of having that trace of Koberger's DNA. Interesting. And, if you eliminate that evidence, what evidence does the prosecution have, physically placing Koberger at the home the night of the murders? Zero evidence. A roommate's claim is not evidence, unfortunately. And that particular roommate has a bit of explaining to do of her own. If her accounts and actions are questionable, the defense can question the credibility of her accounts, merely based on her suspicious decision-making during that night. Cell phone data indicates that Koberger was in that area months prior. Cell phone data can be used against a suspect, but apparently they haven't found any real evidence to support the charge against the suspect. Overall, what we have here is a very fuzzy case, which doesn't bode well for the prosecution. The prosecution more so, because they are accusing the suspect of murder, so the burden of proof is on their end. And without key pieces of evidence, you can't physically place the suspect in the home the night of. Simply put, you need empirical evidence, not circumstantial evidence. A suspect is more than likely facing the death penalty. You better have all the evidence you need to convict. And by law, even if you did place the suspect in the home the night of, without any evidence that he murdered anyone, he is still innocent until proven guilty of murder. You know, such as proving this guilt by way of a knife found with his DNA on it, instead of a knife sheath. Or, collecting, get this, bushy eyebrow hair samples from the crime scene, which could have been found due to the physical altercation. Or, collecting blood samples from the crime scene. Or even, finding blood samples somewhere in the suspect's vehicle. Blood, 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 where's the damn blood in a bloodbath? These are human beings, right? They were stabbed to death, right? Don't human beings bleed? If I'm not mistaken, when you are stabbed, blood comes out of that wound, right? I may be mistaken, nope, that's a fact. Well, all it takes is a bit of bleach. And if there's more than one victim, I guess you'll need a bit more time to clean it all up. Perhaps 8 hours? We are non-biased, we do not support the defense, nor the prosecution. Our job is to provide the information necessary to come to the most logical conclusion. This is the chaos sector.